Judges chapter 6, it's in the Old Testament. It's right after Joshua. I went through Joshua and Judges in the fall, my own devotional time, and I found them quite fascinating books. And this one, Judges chapter 6, is all about a guy named Gideon. Now, if you're going to look at Old Testament heroes, when I was a kid, we heard a lot about David, and we heard a lot about how, he attacked the giant and won. We heard a lot about Samson. We all wanted to be like him. Then later I found out he was an idiot and was just a fool, and he got led astray by women and got defeated, and he was not so great a guy, although he was human. And everybody that you encounter in the Bible is human, and what we have a tendency to do is kind of not talk too much about their humanity and only about their noble deeds, which a lot of them did. But Gideon is an unlikely hero, and that's why the sermon's called an unlikely hero. He followed a judge named Deborah. Deborah was a great lady, a woman who led Israel well for a long time, and she did her job so good that so well that Israel had peace for like 40 years. And then she died, and what usually happened in the book of Judges, it goes like this. They got a judge, he's a good leader, or she's a good leader, and then the leader dies, and the people, it's like they go crazy, they go awry, they go flaky, and they start following all these weird gods that the Amorites and all the people around them worshipped. And then what happens is when they wander away from God, who is their shepherd, just like when stupid sheep wander away from their shepherd, the wolves start to get them. And this is what happened. This is why God wants us to stay close to Him, so He can protect us. Because when we wander away, then we're open prey for these wolves. And that's what happened. They wandered away from God again, and that's where we come to Judges chapter 6, because they were getting just pasted by these Midianites. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years He gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. So these bad guys were so bad that literally the people had to run for the hills and take shelter in caves to get away from them, so they weren't probably raped and abused and murdered and everything taken from them. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, these Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither their sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. That's usually what happens with humans, right? We wander away from the Lord, or we make some choices that get us into deep weeds, and then that's when we call out to God for help. And the great thing about God, and that uncreated song we sung is so true, is that one of the greatest things about His majesty is that He has eyes of mercy. And then when we humble ourselves and we turn to Him, that's when He sends the help. And that's in verse 7 we continue. When the Israelites cried to the Lord because of Midian, He sent them a prophet who said, "This is what happened. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the power of your oppressors. I drove them out before you, and I gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship these gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell." But you didn't listen to me. God says, this is what happened. This is why you're in the mess you're in. And He says, it's not like God is a harsh God who's expecting like 613 rules that you follow to the T. He's a God that says, if you follow the rules, it's because I want you close to me so you're safe. And you wandered away, and then you got pasted by these bad guys. And that's where we come upon Gideon in chapter 7. And in verse 11, God visits Gideon. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. So here's Gideon. He is a normal, ordinary guy, like us guys here today. Or if Gideon was a woman, He would be a normal person just like you and me. And he's in a wine press, which it's kind of like maybe an above ground swimming pool. He's in there and he's probably ducked down. He's trying to make some flour so his family can survive. And he's hiding because if the Midianites rode by, they'd maybe kill him and steal his food. So maybe they're up in the bush hiding. And Gideon is not like Rambo, who is in the forest helping people, who used to be a mighty warrior who wants to get away from it all. He could break your neck with his pinky. Gideon's a normal guy, and he's trying to hide and survive like everybody. And it's kind of like the whole nation of Israel for 7 years had been beat up so bad that they were wandering around like whipped dogs. If you ever go down to the SPCA and you see an animal that's been beaten and beaten and beaten, and you just walk up to the cage and you're just trying to be nice to them, they will totally cower. This is probably what Gideon was like. He didn't want to die. Nobody wants to die. And then God shows up in his life, into his world of fear and idols. And in verse 14, God says, the Lord turned to him and said, no, let's back up. There we go. Verse 12. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon's like, are you talking to me? Mighty warrior? Nobody's called me that. I'm like Gideon. And later he'll tell you, I'm the least in my family, and you're calling me mighty warrior? But that verse, what it's saying is this: God is with you. Because God is with you, you are a mighty warrior. That's what it means. None of us would say, maybe some of us would, but none of us would say most likely that, yeah, I'm a mighty warrior. But God says, you are, because I am with you. Because you can do things with God that you can't do alone. He takes ordinary human beings and he makes them extraordinary. You are not normal people if you have Jesus Christ in your life. You are extra normal. Maybe you're a little weird too, but you are people with Jesus living in your life. And let's just continue here. The excuses start to come. Gideon says in verse 13, if the Lord is with us, with me, why has all this bad stuff happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But the Lord has abandoned us and put us in the hand of Midian. So Gideon was accurately seeing what was happening to his people. But verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? See, this wasn't just an angel. This was Jesus in the flesh. That word Lord in verse 14, L-O-R-D, is capitalized in a lot of your Bibles. That is the name of Yahweh himself. This is Jesus coming down in the flesh saying, I am with you. I am sending you. Go in the strength you have. And if you look up, which I did because I got the cool Bible program that tells me I can't say what the Hebrew word is pronunciation-wise, but that word strength means you have the capacity to go in my strength. You have abilities you don't even know about yet. You have the capacity to go and do amazing things. Now go. I am sending you. So the God of the universe is sitting down on Gideon's backyard lawn and telling him, go in the strength you have. You do have the strength to do this. I am with you. It's amazing. But a couple things had to happen first. First thing is, there was 2 idols that Gideon had to get rid of in his life. The first one was literally an idol that the town came to worship. Back then they worshipped this little god Baal, or Baal, I don't know how you say his name, it's B-A-A-L. And he had a wife, Baal, the god, had a consort named Asherah, and they built a big pole to her to worship. And people would do sick things, like even child sacrifice, to worship these gods. It was just a warped society. And God said, you know what? You and your town and your family have been worshiping this idol. You're going to tear that thing down and build a proper altar. And verse 25. Here we go. The same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd. He had already sacrificed one to God. The one that's 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering to me. So Gideon did this. He took 10 of his servants, did as the Lord told him, but because he was afraid of the whole town, his family, the men of the town, he did it at night rather than in the daytime, because everybody worshipped these idols. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished with the Asherah pole beside it cut down and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. And then it goes on to say how all these guys in town wanted to kill Gideon because he had torn down their church to Baal and Asherah. And Gideon's dad stands up for him and says, look, if this God is having a problem, if he's a real God, let him defend himself. And that's later on in the Bible. But he had to destroy the idol and come back to worshiping the one true God. And you and I live in a society that most people don't have a little idol, like a little Buddha or something in the house that they pray to. Some do. But most of us westernized Canadian people don't have that kind of idol that we bow to in our home. But Canadians have tons of idols. And an idol is anything that we worship besides the one true God. Tonight, a whole bunch of little idols are walking down their little red carpet in little old Hollywood for the idol worship. And they're all on the magazine covers, and everyone wants to know what's going on with Brad and Angelina. You know, and it's just like sick, right? And like there's people dying in the world, there's soldiers giving their lives for their countries, and they don't make the news near as much as Britney Spears and all these people. Now, we should, you know, if you see these people on TV, pray that they'll smarten up and that they'll find that there's more to life than all these things that are destroying them. They're people, they need prayer too. But it just shows how off center the whole Western culture is, you know. We all have idols. And I don't know what your idol is, and I can't answer that question for you, but we have idols that are distracting us from worshiping the one true God. You can tell if you're worshiping an idol because you're putting too much time, too much thought, too much energy, and too much money into your idol. Whatever that is, whatever subject, whatever field of study, whatever goal you have in life, if you're putting all that into its worship, and Jesus says today, come back. Because you will be a bolder, happier, healthier, more joyful people if you just tear down that idol and build a proper altar of worship to Jesus in your life and get that pipeline of His power and holiness pouring into your life. And then you'll be better at life, just doing life, normal, everyday life, being a mom or a dad or whatever you do. And it's just tearing down the idol. And then in verse 34 of chapter 6. The Spirit of the Lord, after he tore down this idol, came upon Gideon. And he blew a trumpet and he summoned the Abiezrites to follow him. When he got his idol torn down, then God blessed him with His holy power and His Spirit, and Gideon became a leader. Maybe you're wondering why you're not having influence on your friends' lives. Tear down your idols, come back to Jesus today, and the Spirit of the Lord will make you into a person of influence. And He's not asking us to be Billy Grahams here. He's asking you to be a leader in your circle of influence and become a leader like Gideon did. This guy that was hiding in the bush was now a leader. The second idol Gideon had to tear down, though, was the idol we all worship, human might. And chapter 7, verse 2, Gideon had amassed himself an army of 32,000 guys. Not bad. We're going to go kick the Midianites' butt. We got 32,000 guys that are angry, going to do something about this injustice. 7 verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. Announce to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So, 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. I'm sure Gideon was respectfully saying, God, do you know what you're doing? You just said anybody that was a little bit afraid could take off, and look at them. They just took off. I'm like, 10,000 left. What am I supposed to do? Like, it says in chapter 6 that the bad guys, there were so many of them, it was like a swarm of locusts. And here he had 32,000. Okay, you know, we'll do the beat the odds thing with our underdog army here, 32,000, and God cuts it down. Whoa! And then the next thing, He blows you further away. Verse 4 of chapter 7. But the Lord said to Gideon, there's still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I'm going to sift them out for you there and find the ones that I want to keep. And eventually God says, there's 9,700 still, too many. I want it down to 300. I'm sure Gideon was just like, what have I signed up for? Oh, man. And this is how he did it. He said, Gideon took the men down to the water. The Lord said, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths, and all the rest got on their knees to drink like a dog. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped with the water like this, I will save you with those 300 men, and I'll give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. So Gideon fired 9,700 of his soldiers for how they drank water. And God kept 300 guys. Like, I'm sure Gideon was just really wondering what he was doing. 300. Okay. And he went and he had a beer or something to calm down. I don't know. But it must have just blown him away. But God said, this is how I'm going to do it. 300 guys in order that Israel can't boast that they did it on their own. I'm going to strip down the extra trimmings of your nice big army to bare bones so it's obvious I did the work. That's what God's saying. The fearful can go home. The soldiers that are going to stay are 300. I'm sure it just blew Gideon's mind. But this is how God does things. He always does it backwards to what we think. We think it's got to be done polished. It's got to be done with the best of humanity. You know, we're not going to elect a prime minister who is a homeless guy down on 3rd Avenue. We'd never do that. And God was doing that kind of stuff all the time in the Bible. He'd always do it outside the human box. Turn to 2 Corinthians in the Bible, in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul was a murderer. The Apostle Paul started out with the name Saul. He would go around killing Christians. And Jesus shook his world one day, and in a blinding vision of heavenly light, blinded Paul and told him to smarten up and turn around and follow me. And he did that. He started following Jesus. All of a sudden, this murderer of Christians and this Pharisee turned around to become the guy that wrote more than half the New Testament. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10, Paul would get a lot of visions from Jesus. And Paul says this in verse 7 of chapter 12 in 2 Corinthians. To keep me from becoming conceited, because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. God let Satan make me sick. Basically, Paul's saying he was sick. And then 3 times in verse 8, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord, take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then it gives God an opportunity to make me strong, to be strong. And that is how God does it in this world. He takes weak, wounded, broken people with no education, some of them, and He uses them to be a light to the community. He uses them to feed the poor. Takes a little old lady named Mother Teresa who, if she was dressed in normal Canadian garb and had walked by with a cane, you would just think some withered old lady there. But what was she doing? She was changing the world. Today's culture is always bigger is better. You need a master's, PhD, you need eloquence, you need polish. God says, no, you don't. There's a guy named Jonathan Edwards, a pastor who lived a couple hundred years ago, and he became famous for his writings. But if you saw the guy preach, you would probably not go to that church if you were only there one Sunday. Because he was so nervous and shy, he literally held his notes like this. And he would shake while he was reading. But it's recorded history that the Sunday he spoke the sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, while he was doing this and reading the notes and barely getting through them, the Spirit of God so moved on that church that people were clinging to the posts and getting off their chairs, and because they could feel the fires of hell beneath them, because God had so moved on that place. and you got a guy shaking. Yet the movie Amazing Grace is a great movie to watch. You got a guy with colitis who is a nervous individual, a lone parliamentarian named William Wilberforce. One guy stood up against hundreds of politicians and ended the slave trade and stopped little kids from going down holes this big to work 12 hours in the coal mines so they could go to school and have a life. One guy. And he was not like Hercules. Right? This is history. Mark Buchanan is a pastor who's wrote a couple of good books like Your God is Too Safe and The Rest of God. And his neighbor, he's a pastor on Vancouver Island, his neighbor told him, he showed up at church, and Mark's like, "Oh, your neighbor, you're here at church." He said, "Yeah, I heard you yelling at your kids in the backyard." And I thought, if that guy's a pastor and he yells at his kids, I yell at my kids, I can go to church too. You know, like Mark Buchanan, I'm sure he was embarrassed. I'd be embarrassed if my neighbor found out that Bob the pastor was yelling at his kids, and I'm sure they've heard it. But God used his weakness. You know, last night in my sermon, I read those verses about how God separated those guys, how they were drinking, and my dyslexic brain messed it up. And I told everybody last night a lie. I said that it was the guys God chose that got down on their faces and drank the water like a dog. And then later somebody who loved me and didn't want me to do this again this morning told me I got it wrong. And I'm like, oh great, I just lied to 40 people last night. You know, first time I spoke at my dad's church in Quesnel after graduating with my degree and getting a job. I was there for holidays. I was going to do a sermon on the preventative maintenance of church unity. You know what I got up and said at the beginning of my sermon? In my dad's church, who I wanted to impress, I said, today I want to do a sermon on the preventative maintenance of church nudity. And everybody just roared, and it took 5 minutes to get everybody back to the subject. It was a disaster. This is a precarious thing, this preaching thing. But God uses people who verbally blunder all the time. My buddy Barry was speaking, and he was talking about some guys that got in a fight. And he had the word fight and ruckus in his head at the same time. And I won't tell you what he said. He said they got into a... No, yeah, I'm sure Barry just wanted to... Okay, I'm going home. Fold up his notes and just walk out. The poor guy. I mean, but God uses weak people who blunder all the time. In the Bible, he called the tax collectors and the uneducated fishermen who didn't know what they were doing. Peter was a hothead. They called him the apostle with a foot-shaped mouth because he stuck his foot in his mouth so many times. Turn to Acts 4. Acts chapter 4. Look at verse 13. Or start at verse 12, actually. Peter is at the end of a speech he's giving the Sanhedrin, the ruling priests. And he's talking about Jesus. Jesus has now gone back to heaven. Peter is now kind of the leader of the apostles, even though he's just a normal guy. He finishes by saying to them, salvation is found in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. And the Bible says in verse 13, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and the people took note that these men had been with Jesus. And that's the kicker. Unschooled, ordinary people. You hang out with Jesus Christ and He turns your life upside down and His Spirit runs through you, His power runs through you despite your weakness, and He will use you. Unschooled, ordinary people. And I'm not saying you are unschooled, ordinary people. Some of you have degrees that are way beyond any education I have. But God will use you. But He always does things backwards. Now I'll go back to Judges chapter 7 and we'll see how this ends with this ragtag little army of 300. You know, I used to draw comic books when I was a kid, and I do a little bit of fictional writing, and if I was going to write how this ended, I would do the old 300 like the movie thing last year, which I haven't seen, but I guess it's 300 guys that, you know, stand up against all these bad guys, and I would have these guys, okay, it's 300 of us, we could do this, get the football player, huddle, inspirational speech, they pull out the swords, they go down, and they're like Rambo and they kill all the bad guys. It's not at all what happens here. It blows my mind. Chapter 7, verses 19. and following. Gideon and the 100 men he had with him, because they split up into 3 groups of 100, reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch of the night. Just after they changed the guard, they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hand. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. They had little torches in these jars. Grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. You have 300 guys surrounding this camp, and these soldiers have in their left hand a torch and in their right hand a trumpet. And humans don't have 3 hands. None of these guys were even holding a sword. It blew my mind. I was like, wow, Gideon, hey, just wondering, could we attach a headlamp to us so I could have a sword? We're going into battle here. And God was like, no, Gideon, they have a torch and they have a trumpet to worship me and to call down me, and I will beat up the bad guys. And look at verse 22. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled all the way to these places I can't pronounce, and they start killing each other. I'm sure that Gideon's soldiers they blew their trumpets, they had their torch, they held their position, they didn't even go into the camp. And all of a sudden, I'm sure they were going, there's something you don't see every day. Look at those guys, they're killing each other. This is really easy. I'm sure it just blew their mind. And then it made sense. I get it. God's doing this. I get to be a witness to what He's going to do, even though I'm just standing here, I haven't even got a sword in my hand. And later on, they go to rout the army, and then they do get the swords out, and Gideon turns into a Rambo guy and butchers a bunch of bad guys. Guys, you're going to want to read that later. Women, I don't know. But it's fun. But God caused the enemy to go nuts and cut each other down and slice their own soldiers to bits. Because when we have hope and confidence in God's ability to use you, even though it doesn't make sense, He will do amazing things in your life with you. I am with you. This is the key thing today. God is saying to each of you, He is saying, Charles, mighty warrior, the Lord is with you. He is looking at you and He's saying, Chelsea, you're a mighty warrior, the Lord is with you. He's looking at you and He's saying, Doug, you are a mighty warrior. I am with you. You may not feel you've got your life together. I don't. But I know God is with me because He has said, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I'm going to use you in spite of your weakness. He is with you, mighty warrior. This is the thing. You have to listen to the voice of truth in the Bible. It tells you a different story than what the world tells you, that you haven't got it together, you can't be used. David said in the Psalms, some trust in chariots. I trust in the name of the Lord my God. I am with you. You're my child. You're my friend. Abraham was a coward. He let his wife get taken away by other men so they didn't hurt him. Moses didn't like speaking in public. He was like Jonathan Edwards. He was shy. Ruth, Pastor Brian talked about her last week. She was a Moabite. People thought Moabite women were trash. And God called her and put her into the lineage of Jesus Christ. She became a great-great-great-grandmother of the Lord. Normal people. Gideon, a nobody, an unlikely hero. Listen to God, and God used him. This is the one supreme truth. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Remind yourself. I'm going to read you a few verses to finish up. Listen to what God says. Joshua 1 verse 9. God says, I have commanded you today. Be strong and be courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Wherever you set your foot this week, God is with you. The Spirit of Jesus is with you just as much as Jesus was sitting in your car having coffee with you. And in Hebrews, I ran a whole bunch of great verses yesterday. I want to read you some from the book of Hebrews. You write these down and go see them later in your Bible. Hebrews 10, verse 39. But we are not of those who shrink back and were destroyed, but we're those who believe and are saved. Hebrews 11:32. What more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you all about all these guys in the Bible. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who ruled, became powerful in battle, and routed foreign armies. Amazing stuff. In Hebrews 12, 2 and 3, this is the key for us to remember. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. 12 verse 2, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It's all about Jesus. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Focus on Jesus all week. Make him your obsession, and you will be a different person. You will be used by him in ways you can't imagine. And it might not ever be that you ever get recorded in some bit of Christian history, but you're going to be doing exploits for him because you are his child. But you have to listen to the voice of truth this week, not those voices that tell you something else, that you are not able to be used by God. And I want to end this just by listening to a song by Casting Crowns. That this is from their concert video. It's called The Voice of Truth. Just listen to the words and hear the voice of truth speaking to you. The Lord is with you, mighty warriors.